Beware of the Trains by Edmund Crispin. Read by Matthew Jones. Jolting slightly, the big posters on the hoardings took themselves off rearwards, and with sudden acceleration, like a thrust in the back, the electric train moved out of Ballaston Junction, past the blurred radiance of the tall lamps in the marshalling yard, past the diminishing constellations of the town's domestic lighting, and so out across the 8-mile isthmus of darkness, at whose further extremity lay Cluff. Ballaston had seen the usual substantial exodus, and the few remaining passengers whom chance had left oddly and, as it turned out, significantly distributed, were able at last to stretch their legs, transfer hats, newspapers, and other impedimenta from their laps to the vacated seats beside them, and for the first time since leaving Victoria, to relax and be completely comfortable. Mostly they were somnambulant at the approach of midnight, but between Ballaston and Cluff none of them actually slept. Fate had a conjuring trick in preparation. They were needed to witness it. The station at Cluff was not large, nor prepossessing, nor, it appeared, much frequented. But in spite of this, the train, once having stopped there, evinced an unexpected reluctance to move on. The whistle's first confident blast having failed to shift it, there ensued a moment's offended silence, then more whistling, and then, when that also failed, a peremptory, unintelligible shouting. The train remained inanimate, however, without even the usual rapid ticking to enliven it. And presently Gervase Fenn, Professor of English Language and Literature at the University of Oxford, lowered the window of his compartment and put his head out, curious to know what was amiss. Rain was falling indecisively. It tattooed in weak, petulant spasms against the station roof, and the wind on which it rode had a cutting edge. Wan bulbs shone impartially on slot machines, timetables, a shuttered newspaper kiosk, on governmental threat and commercial entreaty, on peeling green paint and rust-stained iron. Near the clock, a small group of men stood engrossed in peevish altercation. Fenn eyed them with disapproval for a moment, and then spoke. "Broken down?" They swivelled round to stare at him. "Lost the driver?" This second query was instantly effective. They hastened up to him in a bunch, and one of them, a massive, wall-eyed man who appeared to be the station-master, said, "For God's sake, sir, you ain't seen him, have you?" "Seen whom?" Fenn demanded mistrustfully. "Well, the motorman, sir. The driver." "No, of course I haven't. What's happened to him?" "He's gone, sir. Hooked it somehow or other. He's not in his cabin, nor can we find him anywhere on the station either." "Then he has absconded, with valuables of some description, or with some other motorman's wife." The station-master shook his head, less, it appeared, by way of contesting this hypothesis than as an indication of his general perplexity, and he stared helplessly up and down the deserted platform. "It's a rum go, sir, and that's a fact." "Well, there's one good thing about it, Mr. Maycock," said the younger of the two porters who was with him. "He ain't got clear of the station, not without being seen." The station-master took some time to assimilate this, and even when he had succeeded in doing so, did not seem much enlightened by it. "How do you make that out, Wally?" "Well, after all, Mr. Maycock, the place is surrounded, isn't it?" "Surrounded, Wally? What on earth do you mean, surrounded?" Wally gaped at him. "Lord, Mr. Maycock, didn't you know? I thought you'd have met the inspector when you came back from your supper." "Inspector?" Mr. Maycock could scarcely have been more bewildered if his underling had announced the presence of a snab or a greavy. "What inspector?" "Scotland Yard chap, and half a dozen men with him. They're after a burglar. They thought he'd be on this train." Mr. Maycock, clearly dazed by this melodramatic intelligence, took refuge from his confusion behind a hastily contrived breastwork of outraged dignity. "And why was I not informed of this here?" "You have been informed," snapped the second porter, who was very old indeed, and appeared to be temperamentally subject to that vehement, unfocused rage which one associates with men who are trying to give up smoking. "You have been informed. We've just informed you." Mr. Maycock ignored this. "If you would be so kind, it would be helpful for me to know what time these persons of whom you are speaking put in an appearance here." "About 20 to 12 it'd be, 10 minutes before this lot was due in." "And it wouldn't have occurred to you, would it?" Here Mr. Maycock bent slightly at the knees, as though the weight of his sarcasm was altogether too much for his large frame to support comfortably. "To have a deco in my room and see if I was here?" "Oh, no, I'm only the station master. That's all I am." "I'm very sorry, Mr. Maycock," said Wally in a tone of voice which effectively cancelled the apology out. "But I wasn't to know you was back, was I? I told the inspector you was still at your supper in the village." At this explanation, Mr. Maycock, choosing to overlook the decided resentment with which it had been delivered, became magnanimous. "Well, there's no great harm done, I dare say," he pronounced, and the dignity of his office having by now adequately been paraded, he relapsed to the level of common humanity. "Burglar, eh? Was he on the train? Did they get him?" Wally shook his head. "Not them. False alarm, most likely. They're still hanging about, though." He jerked a grimy thumb towards the exit barrier. "There's the inspector there." Hitherto no one had been visible in the direction indicated, but now there appeared, beyond the barrier, a round, benign, clean-shaven face surmounted by a grey Homburg hat, at which Fenn bawled, "Humbleby!" in immediate recognition, and the person thus addressed, having delivered the injunction, "Don't move from here, Milliken," to someone in the gloom of the ticket hall behind him, came onto the platform, and in another moment had joined them. He was perhaps 55, small as policemen go, and of a compact build which the neatness of his clothes accentuated. The close-cropped greying hair, the pink affable face, the soldierly bearing, the bulge of a cigar-case in the breast-pocket, and the shining brown shoes. These things suggested the more malleable sort of German petit bourgeois. To see him close at hand, however, was to see the grey eyes, bland, intelligent, sceptical, which effectively belied your first superficial impression, showing the iron under the velvet. "Well, well, chance is a great thing." "What?" said Fenn severely, his head still projecting from a compartment window like a gargoyle from a cathedral tower. "Is all this about a burglar?" "And you will be the station-master?" Humbleby had turned to Mr. Maycock. "You were away when I arrived here, so I took the liberty—" "But I was not, sir," Mr. Maycock interrupted, anxious to vindicate himself. "I was in my office the whole time, only these lads didn't think to look. Hello, Mr. Foster." This last greeting was direct to the harassed guard, who had clearly been searching for the missing motorman. "Any luck?" "No sign of him," said the guard sombrely. "Nothing like this has happened on one of my trains before." "It is Inkson, isn't it?" No, it's Phil Bailey." "Bailey?" "Yeah, Bailey sometimes took over from Inkson on this run." Here the guard glanced uneasily at Fenn and Humbleby. "It's irregular, of course, but I don't know no harm, not as I can see. Bailey's home is Banbury, you see, the other end of his line. He'd have to catch this train anyhow to get to it, so sometimes he took over when Inkson wanted to stop in town. And now this has to happen. Oh, there'll be trouble. You mark my words, there'll be trouble." Evidently the unfortunate guard expected to be visited with a substantial share of it. "Well, I can't hold out no longer," said Mr. Maycock. "I'll have to ring headquarters straight away." He departed in order to do this, and Humbleby, who still had no clear idea of what was going on, required the others to enlighten him. When they had done this, "Well, one thing's certain, and that is your motorman hasn't left the station. My men are all around it, and they had orders to detain anyone who tried to get past them." At this stage an elderly businessman who was sharing the same compartment with Fenn, and with an excessively genteel young woman of the sort occasionally found behind the counters of post offices, irritably inquired if Fenn proposed keeping the compartment window open all night, and Fenn, acting on the hint, closed the window and got out onto the platform. "None the less," he said to Humbleby, "it'll be as well to interview your people and confirm that Bailey hasn't left. I'll go the rounds of you, and you can tell me about your burglar." They left the guard and the two porters exchanging theories about Bailey's defection, and walked along the platform towards the head of the train. "Goggett is my burglar's name. Alfred Goggett," said Humbleby. "He's wanted for quite a series of jobs, but for the last few months he's been lying low. We haven't been able to put our hands on him. Earlier this evening, however, he was spotted in Soho by a plain-clothes man, named incongruously enough Diggett." "Really, Humbleby?" "And Diggett chased him to Victoria. Well, you know what Victoria's like. It's a rambling terminus, apt to be full of people. Anyway, Diggett lost the man there. Now, about midday today, one of our more reliable narcs brought us the news that Goggett had a hideout here in Cluff. So this afternoon Milliken and I drove down here to look the place over. Of course, the Yard rang up the police here when they heard Goggett had vanished in Victoria, and the police here got hold of me, and here we all are. It was obviously a very good chance Goggett would catch that train, only unluckily he didn't. No one got off here. No one got off all on. And as I understand it, this is the last train of the day, so for the time being there is nothing more we can do. Sooner or later, of course, he'll turn up at his cottage here. Then we'll have him. And in the meantime, there's the problem of Bailey," said Fenn thoughtfully. "In the meantime, there's that." It proved that the 6 damp but determined men whom Humbleby had culled from the local constabulary had been so placed about the station precincts as to make it impossible for even a mouse to have left without their observing it, and not even a mouse, they stoutly asserted, had done so. Humbleby told them to stay where they are until further orders, and returned with Fenn to the down platform. "No loophole here, and it's an easy station to invest. If it had been a great sprawling place like Broughton, well, I could have put 100 men round that, and Goggett might still have got clear. Of course, it's quite possible that Ballston's where he did leave the train. One thing at a time. It's Bailey we're worrying about now, not Goggett. Bailey's obviously still on the station, or else somewhere on the train. I wonder what the devil he thinks he's up to. Well, in spite of you and your men, he must have been able to leave his cabin without being observed." They were passing the cabin as Fenn spoke, and he stopped to peer in at the vacant interior. "As you see, there is no way through from it to the remainder of the train." Humbleby considered the disposition of his forces, and having done so, yes, he could have left the cabin without being seen, and for that matter got to shelter somewhere in the station buildings. Weren't the porters on the platform when the train came in? No. They got so overwrought when I told them what I was here for, the younger one especially, that I made them keep out of the way. I didn't want them gaping when Goggett got off the train, making him suspicious. He's the sort of man who's quite capable of using a gun if he thinks himself cornered. Maycock? Oh, he was in his office, asleep, I suspect. As to the guard, well, I could see his van from where I was standing. He didn't even get out, not till he was ready to start the train off again. So there really wasn't anyone to keep an eye on the motorman's doings. However, we're bound to find him. He can't have left the precincts. I'll get a search party together. We'll have another look, a systematic one this time. Systematic or not, it turned out to be singularly barren of results. It established one thing only, and that was that beyond any shadow of doubt, the missing motorman was not anywhere in or under the station, nor anywhere in or under his abandoned train. And unfortunately it was also established that he could not, in the nature of things, be anywhere else. Fenn took no part in this investigation, having already foreseen its inevitable issue. He retired instead to the station-master's office, by whose fire he was dozing, when Humbleby sought him out half an hour later. "One obvious answer. is, of course, that Bailey's masquerading as someone else, as one of the 12 people, that's not counting police, who definitely are cooped up on this infernal little station. And is he doing that? No. At least not unless the guards and the 2 porters and the station master are all in a conspiracy together, which I don't for a second believe. They all know Bailey by sight. At least they are all certain no one here can possibly be him. Then yawned. So, what's the next step? What I ought to have done long ago. The next step is to find out if there's any evidence Bailey was driving the train when it left Ballston. Where's the telephone? Behind you. Oh, yes. Oh, I don't understand these interstation phones. I'll use the ordinary one. God help us, hasn't that dolt Maycock made a note of a number anywhere? It's in front of you. Oh, yes. 51709. Humbleby dialed. Oh, is that Ballston Junction? Yeah, I want to speak to the station master. Police business. Yes, all right, but be quick. He's got... Station master? This is Detective Inspector Humbleby of the Metropolitan CID. I want to know about a train which left Ballston for Cluff and Banbury at 1:45. 1:45. Good heavens, yes, this last midnight we've just had. Yes, I know it's held up at Cluff, so am I. No. What I want is information about who was driving it when it left Ballston. Eyewitness information. You did. You actually saw Bailey yourself. Was that immediately before the train left? It was. Well, then there's no chance of Bailey having hopped out and someone else taken over after you saw him. I see. The train was actually moving out when you saw him at the controls. You're sure you're not mistaken? It's important. There's a porter who can corroborate it, is there? No, I don't want to talk to him now. Yes, all right. Yes. Goodbye. Oh, so that is that. So I gathered. Could Bailey have left the train between Ballston and here? The train didn't drive itself in, you know. But never mind that for the moment. Could he? No, he couldn't. Not without breaking his neck. We did a steady 35 to 40 all the way, and we didn't stop or slow down once. Well, I give up. Unless the wretched man vanished like some sort of soap bubble. It has occurred to you he might be dead. Oh, yes, it occurred to me he may be dead and cut up into little pieces, but I still have to find the pieces. Good Lord, Fen, it's like one of those locked room mysteries you get in books. It's an impossible situation. Fen yawned again. No, it's not impossible, no. Rather a simple device, really. But I'm afraid that what we have to deal with is something much more serious than a mere vanishing. In fact, the telephone rang. After a moment's hesitation, Humbleby answered it. The call was for him, and when, several minutes later, he put the receiver back to its hook, his face was grave. They found a dead man, 3 miles along the line towards Ballston. He's got a knife in his back. He's obviously been thrown out of a train. From their description of the face and clothes, it's quite certainly Goggett. And equally certainly that, he nodded towards the platform, is the train he fell out of. Now my first and most important job is to interview the passengers, and anyone who was alone in a compartment will have a lot of explaining to do. Most of the passengers had by now disembarked and were standing around in various stages of bewilderment, annoyance, and futile inquiry. At Humbleby's command, and along with the guard, the porters, and Mr. Maycock, they shuffled, feebly protesting, into the waiting room. And there, with Fen as an interested onlooker, a grand inquisition was set in motion. Its results were both baffling and remarkable. Apart from the motorman, there had been 9 people on the train when it left, and when it arrived at Cluff, and each of them had 2 others to attest the fact that during the whole crucial period he, or she, had behaved as innocently as a newborn infant. With Fenn there had been the elderly businessman and the genteel girl. In another compartment there had likewise been 3 people, no one of them connected with either of the others by blood, acquaintance, or vocation, and even the guard had witnesses to his harmlessness, since from Victoria onward he had been accompanied in the van by 2 melancholy men in cloth caps, whose mode of travel was explained by their being in unremitting personal charge of several doped-looking whippets. None of these 9, until the first search for Bailey was set on foot, had seen or heard anything amiss. None of them, since the train was not a corridor train, had had any opportunity of moving out of sight of his or her 2 companions. None of them had slept, and unless some unknown, travelling in one of the many empty compartments, had disappeared in the same fashion as Bailey, a supposition which Humbleby was by no means prepared to entertain, it seemed evident that Goggett must have launched himself into eternity unaided. It was at this point in the proceedings that Humbleby's self-possession began to wear thin, and his questions to become merely repetitive, and Fenn, perceiving this, slipped out alone onto the platform. When he returned 10 minutes later, he was carrying a battered suitcase, and regardless of Humbleby, who seemed to be making some sort of speech, he carried this impressively to the centre table and put it down there. "In this suitcase," he announced pleasantly as Humbleby's words petered out, "we shall find, I think, the motorman's uniform belonging to the luckless Bailey. And in addition, no doubt," he undid the catches. "Stop him, Humbleby!" The scuffle that followed was brief and inglorious. Its protagonist, tackled round the knees by Humbleby, fell, struck his head against the fender, and lay still, the blood welling from a cut above his left eye. "Yes, that's the culprit, and it will take a better lawyer than there is alive to save him from a rope's end." Later, as Humbleby drove him to his destination through the December night, he said, "Yes, it had to be Maycock, and Goggett and Bailey had, of course, to be one and the same person. But what about motive? Well, obviously the money in that case of Goggett's. There's a lot of it, you know. It's a pretty clear case of thieves falling out, I'd say. We've known for a long time Goggett had an accomplice. It's now certain that accomplice was Maycock. Whereabouts in his office did you find the suitcase?" "Stuffed behind some lockers. Not a very good hiding place, I'm afraid." Well, it can't be said to have been especially difficult a problem. Since Bailey wasn't on the station and hadn't left it, it was clear he'd never entered it. But someone had driven the train in. So who could it have been but Maycock? The 2 porters were accounted for by you. So were the guard and the passengers by one another. There wasn't anyone else. And then, of course, the finding of Goggett's body clinched it. He hadn't been thrown out of either of the occupied compartments or the guard's van. He hadn't been thrown out of any of the unoccupied compartments for the simple reason there was nobody to throw him. Therefore, he was thrown out of the motorman's cabin. And since, as I've demonstrated, Maycock was unquestionably in the motorman's cabin, it was scarcely conceivable that Maycock had not done the throwing. Plainly, Maycock rode or drove into Ballston while he was supposed to be having his supper, and he boarded the train, that is, the motorman's cabin. There he kept hidden till the train was under way, and then took over from Goggett Bailey, while Goggett Bailey changed into civilian clothes. By the way, I take it that Maycock, to account for his presence, spun some fictional tale, as far as he knew, about the police being on Goggett Bailey's track, and that the change was Goggett Bailey's idea. I mean that he had some notion of its assisting his escape at the end of the line. Well, that's it, approximately. I'll send you a copy of Maycock's confession as soon as I can get one made. It seems he wedged the safety handle which operates these trains, knifed Goggett Bailey and chucked him out, and then drove the train into Cluff. There he simply disappeared with the case into his office, and it must have given him a nasty turn to hear the station was surrounded. It did. If your people hadn't been there, it would have looked, of course, as if Bailey had just walked off into the night. But chance was against him all along. Your siege and the grouping of the passengers and the cloth-capped men in the van, they were all part of an accidental conspiracy, if you can talk of such a thing, to defeat him. All part of a sort of fortuitous conjuring trick. Oh, dear me. He gazed out of the car window. Do you know, I believe it's for dawn. Next time I want to arrive anywhere, I shall travel by bus.
So that was Beware the Trains by Edmund Crispin, and it was narrated by our guest narrator, Matthew Jones. So Matthew has a YouTube channel called MJam from London, or he did have, and it was taken down. So he's got a new channel, and I would encourage you to go and check out his work. It's very good, and I will put a link in the show notes. He also has a website, and on that website it has everything from his old YouTube channel, and that's MJam from London. I'll give you the proper address. So it's https://MJAM-from-london.webnode. That's webnode.co.uk. So you can catch all his stuff there. So let me say something about Edmund Crispin. So this story is from an anthology of short stories called Beware of the Trains, detective stories published in 1953. There are 16 stories altogether, and this is the second of them. And they all feature Crispin's amateur detective and Oxford professor Gervais Fenn, who was a professor of English literature, an eccentric with a genius for solving complex cases. A number of the stories also featured Detective Inspector Humbleby of Scotland Yard. I think the name is no coincidence, is it? You know, I had a teacher called Mrs. Umpleby, but I've never heard of Humbleby, and I think it's a reference to being humble. Who also appears in two of the novels in the Fenn series. Apart from one, these stories had all previously appeared in the Evening Standard newspaper, which is the London evening newspaper still these days. So Edmund Crispin was a pen name adopted by Robert Bruce Montgomery, often credited as Bruce Montgomery, a distinguished English author renowned for his contributions to both the crime fiction genre and the world of music. He was born on October the 2nd, 1921, and Gervais Fenn is his detective. He also wrote the scores he was a talented musician for several early films in the renowned Carry On series. So if you know those are a comic slapstick British comedy series, usually with lots of double entendres, dating from the I don't know when they started, but certainly 60s and 70s, possibly even the 50s. Somebody will correct me on that. He was born at Blackwood, Bois Lane and Chesham Bois, posh down there. Chesham Boys, they might say, actually. Bois being the French. I think they do say Chesham Boys. Buckinghamshire. My ex-wife was from Buckinghamshire, so I should know. So we used to spend some time down there. So you think, obviously not at Cheshire Boys. Fourth child and only son of Robert Ernest Montgomery, 1878 to 1962, and Marion Blackwood, née Jarvie. His father was a principal clerk, formerly secretary to the High Commissioner of India in the India Office. Of Irish birth, his family later settled in Hanwell in the London borough of Ealing. Montgomery's mother was Scottish, of a family claiming illegitimate descent from Bonnie Prince Charlie. I would say I do myself, but that's not true. When Montgomery was 2 years old, his family moved round the corner to Domus, a big house in a rural setting that was built according to his father's instructions. He was educated at the Merchant Taylors' School, so there's a kind of a connection there, because my cousin Andy is actually beadle of the Merchant I've got a whistle there, of the Merchant Taylors Association in the City of London. It's one of the guilds, the ancient medieval guilds of the City of London, and he's the beadle. He kind of runs the show for them, So we've had looks around their place anyway. Never mind, And then he went to St John's College, Oxford. Not my cousin Andy, Edmund Crispin, Bruce Montgomery. In 1943, he took a BA in Modern Languages, having been for 2 years its organ scholar and choir master, you see. He became friendly with Philip Larkin and Kingsley Amis, two kind of great literary luminaries of the mid-20th century in British literature. And Montgomery encouraged Larkin's writing ambitions. We're all grateful to him for that. And according to Andrew Motion, by Poet Laureate, by combining a devoted commitment to writing with a huge appetite for drinking and fooling around, he gave Larkin a model of the ways in which art could avoid pretension. That's nice, isn't it? He became a teacher at Shrewsbury School, or Shrewsbury School. There's a thing about Shrewsbury and Shrewsbury. If you're one side of the river, the inner bit, it's the posh bit, and they call it Shrewsbury. But the ordinary people who I used to know there, because I used to live, my daughters were born in Shrewsbury, actually in Shrewsbury. They would all say Shrewsbury, but then I'm kind of common. So Shrewsbury School, and that's where he started writing his detective stories and also practicing his music. Transitioned to, he started as a composer of vocal and choral music, but moved over to do film composition, where there's a bit more money. He composed scores for numerous British comedies during the 1950s, say it was 50s, including 6 films in the renowned Carry On series. Notable works included, if that's what you want to say, Carry On Sergeant, Carry On Nurse, Carry On Teacher, Carry On Constable, Carry On Regardless, and Carry On Cruising. The Doctor film series, there was Doctor in the House. My parents loved those books. He wrote the screenplay and the score for Raising the Wind, 1961. So he was very prolific. He also did The Brides of Fu Manchu in 1966. I imagine that's probably been banned since. And then he wrote detective novels and 2 collections of short stories under the pseudonym Edmund Crispin, taken from a character in Michael Innes's Hamlet Revenge. 9 volumes of these stories appeared between 1944 and 1953, starting with the case of the Gilded Fly. They feature Gervase Fenn, as we've said. Now, a sometimes absent-minded character reportedly based on his tutor, the Oxford professor W.G. Moore. The whodunit novels have complex plots and fantastic, somewhat unbelievable solutions, including examples of the locked room mystery. Now, we haven't actually done any locked room mystery stories, but I'm sure we will. They are written in a humorous, literary, and sometimes farcical style. I think you've got that. Beautifully performed, I thought, as well. I thought the performance and the voices and stuff, and I'm very in awe of that. That was admirable stuff there. Very, very funny by Matthew in his narration there. Edmund Crispin's contribution to British detective fiction is situated within a rich tradition dating back to the late 19th century, building upon the foundations laid by authors like Arthur Conan Doyle, Agatha Christie and Dorothy L. Sayers. Crispin injected new life into the genre with his innovative storytelling techniques and irreverent humour. His works emerged during a period of transition in detective fiction, marked by a shift towards more complex plots and psychologically nuanced characters. Through titles like The Moving Toyshop, 1946, probably his best-known story, and Frequent Hearses, 1950, Crispin demonstrated a keen understanding of the genre's conventions while simultaneously subverting them, paving the way for future generations of writers to explore new narrative possibilities within the realms of crime fiction. So I hope you like that. I thought it was quite amusing, and for me, the performance really made it. Matthew James's voices and characterization was really admirable, I thought. Hope you liked it too. So, yes, we may have more to come from guest narrator Matthew James, and also more from Edmund Crispin. If you just let me know in the comments what you think, and that'll guide me as to what kind of things we introduce. Hope you enjoyed that. More detective stories coming soon, including one next week.